On Christmas morning, my brother unwrapped a MacBook, my sister got a new iPhone, and I got a re-gifted mug from last year. My dad just smiled. "You never made a fuss." I nodded, then pulled out the one set of cash-filled envelopes I had prepared for everyone and quietly slipped each one back in my bag. As I walked out, my uncle shouted, "Wait, where's our gift?" I turned, smiled, and said, "You already got it. Me paying your rent all year." They followed me into the snow, begging for just a little something. I didn't even turn around. I, 29M, thought I'd finally teach my family what they really deserved this Christmas. The snow was coming down hard that Christmas morning, the kind that makes everything look clean and perfect from the inside. I sat in my car outside my childhood home for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the warm glow spilling from the windows. Inside that house, my family was probably arranging presents under the tree, the same routine they'd followed for 29 years. The same routine where I somehow always ended up with the scraps. I pulled out my phone and checked my bank balance one more time. The number stared back at me, smaller now after months of careful planning. In the trunk of my car sat 5 cash-filled envelopes, each containing $2,000. I'd been saving for 8 months, working double shifts at the warehouse and picking up weekend gigs wherever I could find them. The original plan had been simple: give my family the best Christmas they'd ever had. But plans change. I grabbed the small gift bag from the passenger seat and walked up the familiar driveway. My boots crunched through the snow, leaving dark prints behind me. Through the window, I could see my brother sprawled on the couch, probably still in his pajamas at 11 in the morning. My sister was curled up in Dad's old recliner, scrolling through her phone. The scene looked exactly like every Christmas morning from my teenage years, except now I was the one standing outside looking in. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her face lighting up with that practiced holiday smile she'd perfected over the years. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and coffee, telling me how glad she was that I'd made it. I hugged her back and said all the right things about traffic and the weather, but my eyes were already scanning the living room beyond her shoulder. The presents were arranged in their usual formation under the tree. 3 large piles, one notably smaller than the others. I'd seen this setup countless times before, but today it hit differently. My brother's pile contained boxes that were clearly expensive, the sleek packaging of electronics, and brand names I recognized. My sister's collection looked similar, wrapped in shiny paper with elaborate bows. My pile consisted of 2 small packages and something that looked suspiciously familiar. Dad called out from the kitchen, asking if I wanted coffee. I told him yes and settled into the spot on the couch they'd left for me, the same corner I'd occupied every Christmas since I was 12. My brother barely looked up from his phone to acknowledge me, and my sister gave me a quick wave before returning to whatever was apparently more interesting on her screen. The gift-opening ritual began the way it always did, with Mom directing traffic and Dad documenting everything with his camera. My brother went first, as tradition demanded. He unwrapped a MacBook Pro, the kind I'd been wanting for years but could never justify buying for myself. His reaction was enthusiastic but not surprised, like he'd been expecting it. He thanked Mom and Dad with genuine appreciation, already pulling the laptop from its box to examine it. My sister was next. Her main gift was an iPhone, the latest model that had probably cost more than I made in a month at the warehouse. She squealed with delight, immediately starting the setup process and chattering about all the features she'd been waiting to try. Dad joked about the phone bill going up, but his tone was indulgent, the way it always was when it came to his princess. Then it was my turn. I picked up the first package, trying to maintain the Christmas morning enthusiasm that was expected of me. Inside was a pack of generic work socks, the kind you buy in bulk at discount stores. I held them up and smiled, thanking my parents for being practical. The second package contained a gift card to a chain restaurant, $25 that would maybe cover one meal if I was careful about what I ordered. The third package was the one that broke something inside me. It was a coffee mug, ceramic with a faded print that said, "World's Okayest Son." I recognized it immediately because I'd given it to Dad 2 years ago as a joke gift. The bottom still had the small chip I remembered from when he dropped it that same Christmas morning. They'd literally re-gifted something I'd given them, wrapped it up like it was new, and presented it to me like they'd put thought into it. I held the mug up and forced a laugh, commenting on how funny it was. Dad's response cut through me like ice water. He said I never made a fuss about presents anyway, so he figured I wouldn't mind something simple. His tone was casual, dismissive, like my reaction to their gift choices had somehow justified putting in minimal effort year after year. I nodded and smiled, playing my role perfectly. But my hand was already moving toward the bag I'd placed beside the couch, the bag containing 5 envelopes that represented months of sacrifice and planning. Each envelope was thick with 20s and 50s, carefully counted and recounted. Each one had a name written on it in my best handwriting: Mom, Dad, brother, sister, uncle. My uncle was there that morning, as he was every Christmas. He'd been living in my old bedroom for 3 months, supposedly looking for work, but spending most of his time drinking beer and watching television. I'd been covering his share of expenses since he moved in, sending money home every month to help with groceries and utilities. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until he got back on his feet, but I'd heard that promise before. I looked around the room at my family, all of them absorbed in their expensive new gadgets, and something crystallized in my mind. The months of extra shifts, the ramen noodles for dinner, the canceled plans because I couldn't afford to go out. All of it had been for people who couldn't even be bothered to buy me a gift that wasn't recycled from previous years. One by one, I quietly slipped each envelope back into my bag. The motion was subtle, almost absent-minded, like I was just rearranging things. Nobody noticed at first. They were too busy with their new toys and their satisfied conversations about how generous everyone was being this year. I stood up and announced that I needed to head out. Mom looked up from where she was helping my sister set up her phone, asking if I was sure I couldn't stay for lunch. I told her I had other plans, which wasn't technically a lie. I did have other plans now. They just didn't involve staying here and pretending everything was normal. I was halfway to the door when my uncle's voice cut through the holiday chatter. He asked where his gift was, his tone expectant and entitled. The room went quiet, all eyes turning to me like I'd forgotten something important. I turned back to face them, taking in the scene one more time. My brother was still absorbed in his new laptop, my sister was taking selfies with her new phone, and my parents were looking at me with mild confusion. My uncle was sitting forward in his chair, waiting for his envelope like he deserved it. I smiled at him and said he'd already gotten his gift. He looked confused, asking what I meant. I explained that his gift was me paying his rent all year, covering his groceries, making sure he had a roof over his head and food in his stomach. The room got very quiet very quickly. My uncle's face went red, and he started to stutter out some kind of response about how that wasn't the same thing as a Christmas present. I just kept smiling and told him I thought it was plenty. After all, $2,000 in rent and expenses seemed like a pretty generous gift to me. That's when the panic set in. Mom asked what I meant about $2,000, and I explained how much I'd been sending home every month to cover my uncle's share of living expenses. Dad's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he started doing the math in his head. My brother finally looked up from his laptop, and my sister stopped taking pictures. I told them all to enjoy their new gadgets and headed for the door. The sound of chairs scraping against hardwood followed me as they scrambled to their feet. Voices overlapped as they all started talking at once, asking me to wait, to come back, to explain what was happening. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped outside, but it felt good after the stifling atmosphere in the house. I could hear them behind me, calling out as they crowded into the doorway. None of them had bothered to grab coats, so they couldn't follow me far into the snow. My uncle's voice was the loudest, demanding to know if I was seriously not going to give them anything for Christmas. I didn't turn around, just kept walking toward my car. He kept shouting, asking how I could be so selfish during the holidays, how I could ruin Christmas for everyone. I stopped at my car door and looked back at them. They were all standing there in the snow in their house slippers and Christmas morning clothes, looking cold and desperate and confused. I told them not to worry, that I was sure they'd figure something out. After all, my uncle was probably going to need to start covering his own expenses soon anyway. The drive to my apartment was quiet except for my phone buzzing continuously on the passenger seat. I didn't answer any of the calls. When I got home, I spread the 5 envelopes out on my kitchen table and just stared at them. $10,000 in cash, money I'd earned by working myself to exhaustion, money I'd planned to give to people who couldn't even remember what they'd given me for Christmas 2 years ago. Update 1. The calls didn't stop for 3 days. My phone buzzed constantly with messages ranging from angry to pleading to manipulative. My brother wanted to know why I was being so dramatic over presents. My sister couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of what was supposed to be a fun family day. Dad kept insisting that I was overreacting and needed to come home to talk things through like adults. Mom's messages were the hardest to read. She kept apologizing for the mug situation, saying she hadn't realized how it would make me feel. She promised they'd do better next year, that they'd put more thought into my gifts if I would just come back and fix whatever was wrong. But it was my uncle's messages that really showed me I'd made the right choice. He alternated between rage and manipulation, first calling me selfish and ungrateful, then switching to sob stories about how hard his life had been and how much he needed my help. He never once acknowledged that I'd been supporting him for months, never thanked me for anything I'd already done. I started using the cash for things I'd been putting off for years. I got my car repaired properly instead of just patching it up with cheap fixes. I bought groceries without checking every price, filling my cart with things I actually wanted instead of whatever was on sale. I replaced my worn-out work boots with a pair that didn't have holes in the soles. It felt strange at first, spending money on myself without guilt. I'd gotten so used to sending most of my paycheck home that having it in my own account felt almost foreign. But with each small purchase, with each decision to prioritize my own needs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: control. Update 2. New Year's Eve brought a different kind of message. Dad called to tell me that my uncle had finally found a job and would be moving out at the end of the month. His tone was matter-of-fact, like this was just a casual update rather than the resolution of something I'd been financially supporting for months. I asked if my uncle had thanked him for letting him stay rent-free all those months. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Dad eventually admitted that my uncle had been expecting me to keep sending money even after he started working and had been surprised to learn that I'd stopped the payments on Christmas morning. My brother called a few days later with what he probably thought was good news. He'd gotten a promotion at work and wanted to take me out to celebrate. When I asked if he was planning to pay, the conversation got awkward quickly. He explained that he'd thought I would cover dinner since I obviously had extra money now that I wasn't helping family out anymore. I told him I'd be happy to go to dinner if he was paying, but that my finances weren't his concern anymore. He got defensive, saying he didn't understand why I was being so cold to everyone. I reminded him about the MacBook he'd unwrapped Christmas morning and asked if he'd bought it for himself. The conversation ended there. My sister took a different approach. She started sending me pictures of things she wanted to buy, asking for my opinion on whether they were worth the money. It took me a few days to realize she was fishing for offers to pay for them. When I started responding with suggestions for where she could get part-time work to afford her wish list, the pictures stopped coming. Update 3. February brought the first real consequences of my Christmas morning decision. My uncle had moved out as promised, but apparently he'd left behind some bills that my parents couldn't cover on their own. Dad called to ask if I could help with the electric bill, just this once, until they got caught up from the extra expenses of having another person in the house. I asked why my uncle hadn't paid his share before leaving, and Dad got quiet. It turned out that my uncle had never been contributing anything to household expenses, despite having that new job. He'd been pocketing his paychecks while my parents covered his food, utilities, and other costs, apparently expecting me to continue sending money indefinitely. When I declined to cover the electric bill, Dad accused me of punishing them for my uncle's behavior. I reminded him that they'd known about his lack of contribution for months, but had chosen not to say anything to me. I'd been sending money thinking it was temporary help, not realizing I was subsidizing a grown man's complete financial irresponsibility. Mom tried a different strategy. She called to invite me to Sunday dinner, casual and friendly like nothing had happened. When I asked if this was about needing money, she got offended and insisted she just wanted to see her son. But as the conversation continued, she eventually admitted that they were having trouble making ends meet without my monthly contributions. I offered to help them create a budget that worked without my income. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about what they really wanted from that phone call. My brother's promotion, it turned out, came with a catch. His company was restructuring, and while his title and responsibilities had increased, his salary hadn't changed much. He called to explain this situation and ask if I could spot him some cash to help him celebrate his new position properly. When I suggested he celebrate within his means, he got frustrated. He pointed out that I clearly had extra money now and couldn't understand why I was being so stingy with family. I asked him how much he thought I made at the warehouse, and his estimate was nearly double my actual salary. That conversation was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. My family had been operating under the assumption that I had plenty of money to spare, that my contributions to household expenses and my uncle's support were coming from some deep well of disposable income. None of them had bothered to consider what those payments might be costing me in terms of my own financial stability. Update 4. Spring arrived with an unexpected development. My sister called in tears, explaining that she'd gotten into some credit card debt trying to keep up with friends who had more money than she did. The new iPhone had been just the beginning of a spending spree that had gotten out of control, and now she was facing minimum payments she couldn't afford. She asked if I could help her consolidate the debt with a personal loan, promising to pay me back with interest. When I asked how much she owed, the number was staggering. She'd racked up more debt in 3 months than I made in half a year at the warehouse. I told her I'd be happy to help her create a payment plan and budget, but that I wouldn't be giving her money to cover debt she'd created buying things she couldn't afford. She accused me of being heartless and hung up on me. Dad called later that day to discuss my sister's situation. He seemed to think I was being unreasonable by refusing to bail her out, pointing out that family was supposed to help family in times of need. I asked him if he'd taught her about financial responsibility and credit management before giving her that expensive phone for Christmas. The conversation got heated when he accused me of holding grudges over trivial things like Christmas presents. I reminded him about the re-gifted mug and asked if he thought my feelings about being valued by my family were trivial too. He insisted that presents weren't that important, that I should care more about being together than about material things. I pointed out that he'd spent thousands of dollars on my siblings' presents while giving me something from his junk drawer, and asked how that aligned with his speech about materialism not matching. He didn't have an answer for that. Update 5. Summer brought the most surprising development yet. My uncle called me directly for the first time since Christmas morning. He'd been struggling at his new job and was facing eviction from his apartment. His tone was different now, less entitled and more desperate. He actually apologized for taking my support for granted and admitted that he'd never fully appreciated what I'd been doing for the family. He asked if we could meet for coffee to talk things through, and something in his voice made me agree. When we met, he looked different, thinner, more tired, but also more present than I'd seen him in years. He told me about losing his apartment and having to stay in cheap motels, about realizing how much work it took to actually support yourself without someone else paying your bills. He didn't ask for money, which surprised me. Instead, he asked for advice about budgeting and managing expenses. We talked for 2 hours about practical things like grocery shopping strategies and utility conservation. At the end, he thanked me for meeting with him and said he understood now why I'd walked away that Christmas morning. I didn't give him any money, but I did give him something more valuable: the name of a financial counselor who helped people create sustainable budgets. 6 months later, he called to tell me he'd gotten his own apartment and was managing his expenses independently for the first time in his adult life. Update 6. By Christmas of the following year, things looked very different. I hadn't been invited to family dinner, which was fine with me. I'd made plans with friends instead, people who valued my company for reasons beyond what I could contribute financially. My brother sent me a text on Christmas Eve, a simple message wishing me happy holidays and saying he hoped I was doing well. It wasn't much, but it was the first communication from him that hadn't included a request for money or criticism of my choices. My sister never did contact me about her debt situation again, but I heard through extended family that she'd moved back in with my parents and gotten a second job to pay down what she owed. Mom mentioned during a brief phone call that they were all learning to live within their means, though her tone suggested this was somehow my fault. I spent that Christmas morning in my own apartment, drinking good coffee and reading a book I'd bought myself. The 5 envelopes were long since spent, the money invested in my own future and well-being instead of propping up people who'd taken my generosity for granted. At around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from my uncle. He'd sent a picture of a small Christmas tree in what looked like a modest but clean apartment, with a single wrapped present underneath. The message said he was spending the day alone but felt grateful for everything he had, including the lesson I'd taught him about self-reliance. I smiled and sent back a message telling him I was proud of the progress he'd made. It was the first genuinely positive interaction I'd had with a family member since that snowy Christmas morning when I'd walked away from people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Looking back now, I realized that Christmas morning wasn't really about the re-gifted mug or the expensive presents my siblings received. It was about recognition, about being seen as someone whose feelings and efforts mattered. The mug was just the symbol of years of being taken for granted, of being expected to give without receiving even basic consideration in return. The money I kept that day bought me more than just personal comfort and financial stability. It bought me self-respect, boundaries, and the understanding that real family relationships should be built on mutual care and appreciation, not one-sided financial support. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the courage to stop giving to people who don't value what you offer. That snowy Christmas morning, walking away from the desperate voices calling after me, I finally learned what I was worth. And for the first time in years, it felt like enough.